The dust swirled down Main Street as another hot summer day began in Cedar Ridge, Montana territory. It was 1887, and the small frontier town was buzzing with activity. Cowboys rode through with their cattle herds. Railroad workers hammered away at the new tracks, and merchants sold supplies to anyone with coins in their pockets. But for Rebecca Mitchell, none of this excitement mattered. She sat by her kitchen window, watching the world go by while nursing a fresh bruise on her wrist. Her husband Thomas owned the biggest general store in town, which meant they had money and a nice house. To everyone else, Rebecca looked like the luckiest woman in Cedar Ridge. They had no idea what happened behind closed doors. Thomas was a successful businessman, that much was true. He wore fine clothes, spoke well to customers, and always paid his bills on time. The townspeople respected him. They elected him to the town council and asked his opinion on important matters. But Thomas had a dark side that only Rebecca knew about. Every morning, Rebecca had to be careful about everything she did. If the coffee was too weak, Thomas would explode. If she spoke to neighbors for too long, he would accuse her of gossiping about their private business. If she smiled at the wrong person, he would call her names that made her feel worthless. 3 years of marriage had worn her down like water wearing away a stone. Rebecca used to be full of life and laughter. She had dreams of traveling, maybe even writing letters for the local newspaper. Now she barely left the house except when Thomas needed her to run errands. On this particular morning, a new group of cowboys had arrived in town. Their trail boss was looking to sell some cattle and buy supplies before heading north to Wyoming. Among them was a man named Cole Davis, though nobody in town knew his name yet. Cole was different from the other cowboys. He was older, maybe in his 30s, with gray starting to show in his dark hair. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried himself like a man who had seen both good times and bad. While the younger cowboys whooped and hollered as they rode into town, Cole remained quiet and watchful. He had been on the trail for most of his adult life. Cole had seen fights break out over card games, watched men lose everything they owned to bad luck, and helped bury friends who died far from home. These experiences had taught him when to speak up and when to stay silent. They had also taught him to recognize trouble when he saw it. As Cole tied his horse to the post outside Murphy's saloon, he noticed a woman walking quickly down the boardwalk. She kept her head down and moved like she was trying not to be seen. Even from a distance, Cole could tell something was wrong. The way she held her left arm close to her body suggested she was hurt. This was Rebecca, though Cole didn't know her name or her story yet. She was hurrying to the post office to mail a letter to her sister in California. It was the only connection she had left to the world outside Cedar Ridge, and she treasured those brief moments of writing about anything other than her daily struggles. Thomas didn't know about the letters. Rebecca used the small amount of money she earned from mending clothes to buy stamps. She told her sister that everything was fine, that Thomas was a good provider, and that she was happy. But between the lines, her sister could sense that something was terribly wrong. The trail drive had been long and dusty, and Cole was looking forward to a hot meal and a real bed. His plan was simple: stay in town for 2 days, help the boss sell the cattle, then head north with the herd. He had no intention of getting involved in anyone else's problems, but sometimes life has different plans for us. Cole walked into the general store to buy supplies for the trail. The man behind the counter was well-dressed and spoke in a smooth voice, but something about him made Cole uncomfortable. Thomas Mitchell smiled too much and asked too many questions about where the cowboys were headed and how much money they were carrying. When Thomas stepped into the back room to get something, Cole noticed a woman's glove on the floor behind the counter. It was small and delicate, but there were dark stains on the white fabric that looked like dried blood. Cole had seen enough violence in his life to recognize the signs. His jaw tightened as he thought about what might have caused those stains. He picked up the glove and placed it on the counter, then waited for Thomas to return. When Thomas came back, he saw the glove and his face changed for just a moment. The friendly smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and angry. But he quickly recovered and thanked Cole for finding it, claiming his wife was always losing things. Cole nodded and paid for his supplies, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in this seemingly perfect household. As he left the store, he found himself looking for the woman he had seen earlier, wondering if she was the owner of that blood-stained glove. The afternoon sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Most of the cowboys were either drinking in the saloon or sleeping off the trail in the hotel. But Cole found himself walking the streets of Cedar Ridge, observing the town and its people. He saw children playing in the yards, men discussing business on the sidewalks, and women hanging laundry in their backyards. It looked like any other frontier town, full of hard-working people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. But Cole had learned that things were not always what they seemed on the surface. Behind the neat facades and friendly greetings, every town had its secrets. Some people carried pain that others couldn't see, and some carried guilt that ate away at their souls. As the day came to an end, Cole had no idea that tomorrow would bring events that would change everything. He didn't know that his path would cross with Rebecca's in a way that would test everything he believed about right and wrong. All he knew was that something felt off about this town, and 30-plus years of living had taught him to trust his instincts. Tomorrow, those instincts would prove to be absolutely right. Tuesday morning started like any other day for Rebecca, but she could feel the tension in the air as thick as honey. Thomas had been drinking late into the night, which always meant trouble the next day. She moved quietly around the kitchen, trying not to wake him, but every small sound seemed to echo through the house. The coffee pot clinked against the stove. Thomas stirred upstairs. Rebecca held her breath. For 3 long years, she had been walking on broken glass, never knowing what might set him off. In the beginning, Thomas had been charming and kind. He brought her flowers and told her she was the most beautiful woman in Montana territory. But after their wedding, that man disappeared like smoke in the wind. The change happened slowly at first. Thomas would get angry about small things, then apologize and promise it would never happen again. He said he was just stressed about the business, that once things got better, he would be his old self again. Rebecca believed him because she wanted to believe him, but things never got better. They only got worse. Now 3 years later, Rebecca lived in constant fear. She had learned to read the signs of Thomas's moods like a farmer reads the weather. The way he held his shoulders when he came home from work, the tone of his voice when he asked about her day, the number of drinks he poured himself after dinner. Last night had been particularly bad. Thomas had lost money on a business deal with a rancher from the next county. The man had promised to buy a large order of supplies but changed his mind at the last minute. Thomas came home furious, blaming Rebecca for bringing bad luck into his life. "Everything was fine before I married you," he had shouted, throwing his hat across the room. "My business was growing. People respected me. Now look at me." Rebecca had tried to stay quiet, knowing that anything she said would only make things worse. But Thomas kept pushing, demanding that she explain why everything went wrong whenever she was around. Finally, she had whispered that maybe it wasn't her fault. That business deal sometimes fell through for all kinds of reasons. That's when Thomas hit her. It wasn't the first time, but it was the hardest. The blow knocked her backward into the kitchen table, and she felt something in her wrist pop as she tried to catch herself. The pain shot up her arm like lightning, but she didn't cry out. Crying only made Thomas angrier. Now, as she made breakfast with her injured wrist throbbing, Rebecca wondered how much longer she could live like this. She had thought about leaving many times, but where could she go? Thomas controlled all their money. He had slowly cut her off from her few friends in town, claiming they were bad influences. Her family was thousands of miles away in California. Even worse, Thomas had made it clear what would happen if she ever tried to leave him. "No one will believe you," he had told her during one of his rages. "Everyone in this town knows me as a successful businessman and a good husband. They'll think you're just a crazy woman making up stories." Rebecca knew he was probably right. Thomas was charming and well-liked in public. He donated money to the church and helped organize community events. When people saw them together, he always had his arm around her waist and spoke to her in a loving voice. They had no idea that the same hand that gently touched her shoulder in public had left bruises, that she had to hide under long sleeves and high collars. The sound of Thomas's footsteps on the stairs made Rebecca's heart race. She quickly poured his coffee and set his plate on the table, then stepped back to wait for his reaction. Sometimes he would eat in silence. Sometimes he would find fault with everything and start the day with another explosion of anger. This morning, Thomas seemed calmer than she had expected. He drank his coffee and read his newspaper without saying much. Rebecca began to hope that maybe the previous night's violence had satisfied his need to hurt someone, at least for a while. But then Mrs. Henderson knocked on the door. Mrs. Henderson was the pastor's wife, a kind woman who had been trying to befriend Rebecca for months. She often stopped by with small gifts or invitations to church events. Rebecca always had to decline, claiming she was too busy with household duties. This morning, Mrs. Henderson had brought fresh bread from her oven. She noticed the careful way Rebecca held her left wrist and asked if she was hurt. Rebecca quickly made up a story about falling down the stairs, but she could see the concern in the older woman's eyes. "You know, dear," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Sometimes we all need a friend." After Mrs. Henderson left, Rebecca felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. For just a moment, she had felt like someone cared about her well-being. Someone had noticed her pain and offered help without expecting anything in return. But that feeling of hope was about to become her biggest mistake. When Thomas came home for lunch, he was in a foul mood. Another business deal had gone wrong, and he was looking for someone to blame. He noticed that Rebecca seemed different, almost lighter somehow, and it made him suspicious. "What's got you so happy today?" he demanded. "You look like the cat that ate the canary." Rebecca tried to act normal, but Thomas kept pushing. Finally, she mentioned Mrs. Henderson's visit and the fresh bread. She thought it was a safe topic, just a simple neighborly gesture. Thomas's face darkened like a storm cloud. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," Rebecca said quickly. "We just talked about the weather and the church social. Don't lie to me." Thomas slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes jump. "I can tell when you're lying. What did you tell that old busybody about our personal business?" Rebecca tried to explain that they had barely talked about anything important, but Thomas was already working himself into a rage. He accused her of gossiping about him, of making him look bad to the most influential woman in town. "You stupid, worthless woman," he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Mrs. Henderson tells everyone everything she hears. By tonight, the whole town will be talking about us." Rebecca knew that wasn't true. Mrs. Henderson had simply been kind to her, nothing more. But Thomas was beyond reason now. He had been looking for an excuse to release his anger, and Rebecca had given him one without even realizing it. As Thomas grabbed his hat and headed for the door, he turned back to Rebecca with eyes that promised retribution. "We'll finish this conversation later," he said in a voice that made her blood run cold. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of panic. She knew that when Thomas came home, his anger would have grown like a fire feeding on dry wood. She considered running away, but where could she go in a town where everyone knew her as Thomas's wife? As the sun began to set, Rebecca realized she couldn't stay in the house waiting for Thomas to return. She had to get out, even if it was just for a few minutes. She decided to walk to the post office to mail a letter to her sister, hoping that the simple act of connecting with family might give her strength for whatever was coming. She had no way of knowing that this decision would set in motion events that would change her life forever. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Rebecca hurried toward the post office. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Every step felt dangerous, like she was walking toward the edge of a cliff, but she couldn't stop herself. The letter to her sister was clutched tightly in her good hand. It was short and simple. Just a few lines about the weather and the town, but writing it had given her a few minutes of peace. For those brief moments, she could pretend she was just a normal woman writing to family, not someone living in constant fear. Rebecca kept her head down as she walked, hoping to avoid attention. The last thing she needed was for someone to tell Thomas they had seen her wandering around town. But Cedar Ridge was a small place, and it was hard to go anywhere without being noticed. Behind her, she could hear the sound of heavy footsteps getting closer. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the angry rhythm of Thomas's walk. He had found her. "Rebecca!" His voice cut through the evening air like a whip. "Stop right there." She turned around slowly, her mouth dry with fear. Thomas was walking toward her with his face red and his hands clenched into fists. She could smell the whiskey on him from 10 feet away. The afternoon of drinking had not improved his mood. "What do you think you're doing, wandering around town like some loose woman?" Thomas grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into the same wrist he had injured the night before. Rebecca bit her lip to keep from crying out. "I was just mailing a letter," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "A letter?" Thomas's grip tightened. "To who? What lies are you spreading about me now?" Just to my sister in California. I only told her about the weather and— Shut up. Thomas yanked her arm so hard that Rebecca stumbled. You think I'm stupid? I know what you're doing. First you gossip with that Henderson woman. Now you're writing letters full of lies about me. People on the street were starting to notice the commotion. Rebecca could see them slowing down, trying to hear what was happening without appearing to stare. She felt humiliated and scared at the same time. Thomas, please, she whispered. People are watching. Let them watch. Thomas's voice was getting louder. Let them see what happens when a wife doesn't know her place. Before Rebecca could react, Thomas's hand came across her face with a sound like a gunshot. The force of the blow knocked her sideways and she fell hard into the dusty street. Her letter fluttered away in the evening breeze. For a moment the world went quiet. Rebecca lay in the dirt, tasting blood from her split lip, while Thomas stood over her breathing hard. The people on the street had stopped pretending not to watch. They stood frozen in shock, unable to believe what they had just seen. Get up, Thomas snarled. Get up and go home where you belong. Rebecca tried to push herself up, but her injured wrist couldn't support her weight. She was trapped on the ground while Thomas loomed over her, his face twisted with anger and shame at being seen in public like this. I said, get up. Thomas raised his hand again, preparing to strike her while she was down. That's when a voice behind him spoke up. Calm and steady as a stone, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Thomas spun around to see a tall cowboy standing a few feet away. The man wasn't particularly young or handsome, but there was something in his eyes that made Thomas take a step backward. This was Cole Davis, though Thomas didn't know the name yet. Cole had been watering his horse at the trough across the street when he heard the shouting. At first he thought it was just another drunk cowboy causing trouble. But when he looked up and saw a man striking a woman in broad daylight, something inside him went cold and hard. This is none of your business, stranger, Thomas said, trying to sound tough, but his voice shook slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially in public. Cole stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the dusty ground. When a man hits a woman in front of me, it becomes my business. She's my wife, Thomas protested. I have the right to discipline her as I see fit. Cole looked down at Rebecca, who was still struggling to get up from the dirt. Blood was running down her chin, and she was cradling her wrist against her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear and something else that Cole recognized as hope. No man has the right to do this, Cole said quietly. He reached down and gently helped Rebecca to her feet, being careful not to hurt her injured arm. Thomas was furious at being humiliated in front of the whole town. His reputation as a respected businessman was crumbling with every second that this stranger defied him. How dare you interfere with my family? Thomas reached for the gun at his hip, the same weapon he used to threaten Rebecca when she thought about leaving him. But Cole was faster. His hand shot out and grabbed Thomas's wrist before the gun could clear the holster. The cowboy's grip was like iron, and Thomas found himself unable to move. I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Cole said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. There are too many witnesses here, and you've already caused enough trouble for one day. Thomas tried to pull free, but Cole's grip didn't budge. Years of roping cattle and breaking horses had given the cowboy hands that could bend horseshoes. Thomas might as well have been trying to escape from a bear trap. Let go of me, Thomas demanded, but his voice was getting higher and more desperate. When you calm down and start acting like a civilized human being, Cole replied. Until then, you're going to stand right here and think about what you've done. The crowd on the street was growing larger. Word was spreading quickly through the small town that something big was happening on Main Street. People were coming out of shops and houses to see what all the commotion was about. Rebecca stood beside Cole, still bleeding and shaking, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone. Someone had stood up for her. Someone had said that what Thomas was doing was wrong. She didn't know this stranger's name or where he came from, but she knew that her life had just changed forever. The question was whether it would change for the better, or if Thomas would find a way to make her pay for this public humiliation. In the distance, someone was shouting for the sheriff. Cole nodded slightly, knowing that the law would have to get involved now. He just hoped that when the dust settled, justice would be on the side of the woman who had been knocked down in the street for the crime of mailing a letter to her sister. The confrontation was far from over, but the first blow for Rebecca's freedom had been struck. And it had been struck by a cowboy who believed that some things were worth fighting for, even when it meant getting involved in other people's troubles. Not while I live, Cole had said, and he meant every word of it. The tension on Main Street was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas struggled against Cole's iron grip, his face turning red with rage and embarrassment. He had never been challenged like this in his own town, especially not in front of so many witnesses. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, cowboy," Thomas hissed through gritted teeth. "I own half this town. I can make your life very difficult." Cole looked at him with steady eyes that had seen too much violence to be impressed by threats. "And you have no idea who you're dealing with either," he replied calmly. "I've faced down rustlers, outlaws, and men twice your size. You don't scare me." The crowd around them was getting bigger by the minute. Mrs. Henderson had appeared and was gently cleaning the blood from Rebecca's lip with her handkerchief. The pastor was there too, along with several shopkeepers and their customers. Even some of the other cowboys from Cole's trail drive had wandered over to see what was happening. "This is ridiculous," Thomas shouted, trying to appeal to the crowd. "This stranger assaulted me. He grabbed me for no reason. Someone call the sheriff." "The sheriff's already on his way," said Mr. Peterson, who owned the hardware store. "And I think he's going to be very interested in what everyone saw here today." Thomas's face went pale. He realized that his carefully built reputation was crumbling right in front of him. For years he had managed to keep his violence hidden behind closed doors. Now dozens of people had seen him strike his wife in the street like a common brute. "She provoked me," Thomas said desperately. "She was defying me, embarrassing me in public. A man has the right to control his own household. A real man doesn't need to hit a woman to prove he's in control," Cole said quietly. "A real man protects the people who depend on him." Rebecca stood nearby, still shaking, but no longer cowering. For the first time in 3 years, someone was defending her in public. Someone was saying that what Thomas did to her was wrong. The feeling was overwhelming. "You don't understand," Thomas tried again. "She's been talking to people, spreading stories about our private life. She was writing letters full of lies. I had to stop her before she ruined my reputation." Cole glanced at the letter that had fallen in the dust nearby. Mrs. Henderson had picked it up and was holding it carefully. "Mrs. Henderson," Cole said politely, "would you mind reading that letter out loud? I think everyone here would like to know what terrible lies Mrs. Mitchell was spreading." Mrs. Henderson unfolded the paper and cleared her throat. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet street as she read, "Dear sister, I hope this letter finds you well. The weather here has been very hot, but we had a nice rain last week that helped the gardens. The town is busy with cattle drives coming through. I hope you and your family are staying healthy. Please give my love to the children. Your sister, Rebecca." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas's face went from red to white as he realized how foolish his accusation sounded. Here was the pack of lies he had been so angry about. A simple, harmless letter about the weather. "That's it?" asked Mr. Peterson. "That's what you hit your wife for?" Thomas tried to stammer out an explanation, but the damage was done. Everyone could see that he had beaten Rebecca for no reason other than his own anger and need to control her. Sheriff Wilson finally arrived, pushing through the crowd with his hand resting on his gun. He was an older man who had seen plenty of trouble in his years of keeping the peace, but the scene in front of him made his jaw tighten with anger. "What's going on here?" the sheriff demanded. Thomas immediately started talking, claiming that Cole had assaulted him and interfered with his private family business. But before he could get very far, several witnesses started speaking up. "Sheriff, I saw the whole thing," said Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop. "Mr. Mitchell struck his wife so hard she fell down in the street. This cowboy just stopped him from hitting her again." "That's right," added the blacksmith. "The man was standing over her like he was going to kick her while she was down. The cowboy saved her from another beating." Sheriff Wilson looked at Rebecca, taking in her split lip, her careful way of holding her injured wrist, and the fear in her eyes. He had suspected for a long time that something wasn't right in the Mitchell household, but this was the first time he had proof. "Mr. Mitchell," the sheriff said carefully, "hitting your wife in public is against the law. No matter what your reasons might be, she's my wife," Thomas protested. "I have the right to discipline her." "No, you don't," Sheriff Wilson replied firmly. "The law says you can't assault anyone, including your wife. And that's what this was. Assault." Cole finally released Thomas's wrist, but he stayed close enough to grab the man again if necessary. Thomas rubbed his wrist and glared at everyone around him, realizing that he had lost control of the situation completely. "This isn't over." Thomas said to Cole in a low voice. You think you can ride into my town and humiliate me like this? You'll regret it. Cole met his stare without flinching. I'll be here for another day or two. If you want to settle this like men, you know where to find me. But if you touch that woman again, you'll have to answer to me. The sheriff stepped between them. That's enough threats from both of you. Mr. Mitchell, you're coming with me to cool off in a jail cell, and I'll be filing charges for assault. As the sheriff led Thomas away, the crowd began to break up slowly. People were talking in small groups, processing what they had just witnessed. The carefully maintained image of Thomas Mitchell as a respectable businessman had been shattered in front of the whole town. Rebecca found herself standing alone with Cole as the street began to empty. She looked up at this stranger who had changed everything with just a few words and actions. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't even know your name, but thank you. Cole Davis, he said, tipping his hat. And you don't need to thank me, ma'am. Any decent person would have done the same thing. But Rebecca knew that wasn't true. Plenty of decent people had suspected what was happening to her over the years, but no one had ever stepped in to help. Cole was different somehow. What happens now? She asked, suddenly realizing that her life had been turned upside down in the space of a few minutes. Now we make sure you're safe, Cole said simply. Because when your husband gets out of that jail cell, he's going to be even angrier than he was before. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Cole was right. Thomas would never forgive this public humiliation, and he would blame her for all of it. The question was whether she would have the courage to do something about it before it was too late. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and Rebecca's old life was ending with it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but for the first time in years she wouldn't have to face them alone. The jailhouse was only 2 blocks away, but the walk felt like the longest journey of Rebecca's life. News of the confrontation had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, and it seemed like every person in town was either staring at her with pity or whispering behind their hands as she passed. Cole walked beside her, his presence both comforting and terrifying. She was grateful for his protection, but she also knew that his intervention had made everything more complicated. Thomas would never forgive being humiliated in front of the entire town, and he would blame her for every second of it. Mrs. Henderson caught up with them outside the general store. Rebecca, dear, she said gently, you can't go home tonight. Not with Thomas in this state of mind. Rebecca felt panic rising in her chest. But I have to go home. All my things are there, and Thomas will expect me to. Thomas is in jail, Cole reminded her quietly. And when he gets out, he's going to be looking for someone to blame for what happened today. You could stay with my husband and me, Mrs. Henderson offered. At least for tonight until we figure out something more permanent. The word permanent hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had dreamed of leaving Thomas many times, but it had always seemed impossible. Now suddenly people were talking about it like it was a real option. I can't, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. He'll find me, and he'll make me pay for this. Cole studied her face, seeing the fear that had been carved there by years of violence and threats. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Has your husband hurt you before today? Rebecca looked around nervously, even though Thomas was safely locked up 2 blocks away. The habit of protecting his secrets was hard to break even now. It's all right, Mrs. Henderson said softly. You can tell us the truth. We all saw what happened today. Slowly, carefully, Rebecca began to speak. She told them about the bruises she had to hide under long sleeves, about the way Thomas controlled every penny of their money and every minute of her time, about the threats he made when she even thought about leaving. As she talked, Cole's jaw got tighter and Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. They had both suspected that something was wrong, but hearing the details made it real in a way that was hard to bear. How long has this been going on? Cole asked. 3 years, Rebecca admitted, ever since we got married. It started small, but it got worse over time. And you never told anyone? Rebecca laughed bitterly. Who would I tell? Thomas is respected in this town. He gives money to the church and serves on the town council. People think he's a good man. Not anymore, they don't, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. After what everyone saw today, his reputation is finished. But Rebecca knew it wasn't that simple. You don't understand, she said desperately. Thomas is smart. He'll find a way to blame this on me. He'll say I provoked him, that I made him look bad on purpose. He'll convince people that I'm the problem. Sheriff Wilson approached them as they stood talking. His face was grim, and Rebecca could tell he had bad news. "I can only hold Thomas overnight," he said reluctantly. "Unless you want to press formal charges, I'll have to release him in the morning." Press charges? Rebecca felt the world spinning around her. "I couldn't do that. He's my husband." "Ma'am," the sheriff said gently, "what your husband did today was a crime. Assault is assault, whether the victim is a stranger or a spouse. You have the right to see justice done." But Rebecca was shaking her head frantically. "You don't understand. If I press charges against Thomas, he'll destroy me. He'll make sure I have nothing and nowhere to go. He'll tell everyone I'm crazy, that I made everything up." Cole placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What if you didn't have to stay here to face him? What if there was somewhere else you could go?" "Like where?" Rebecca asked. "I don't have any money of my own. My family is in California and I can't afford a train ticket. I don't have any skills that would let me support myself." Mrs. Henderson and Cole exchanged a meaningful look. They had both been thinking the same thing during Rebecca's story. "Actually," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, "there might be options you haven't considered. There are people who help women in situations like yours. People who understand what you're going through." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's a network of folks who believe that no woman should have to live in fear of the man she married. They help with travel money, safe places to stay, even jobs in new towns where abusive husbands can't follow." Rebecca stared at her in amazement. "That really exists?" "It really does," Cole confirmed. "I've met some of these people during my travels. They're good folks who do dangerous work to help women like you start over." For the first time in years, Rebecca felt a spark of hope flickering in her chest. "But what about pressing charges?" The sheriff said. "You don't have to decide that right now," Sheriff Wilson said kindly. "I can hold Thomas until tomorrow evening on a disturbing the peace charge. That gives you time to think about what you want to do." Rebecca looked around at these three people who had appeared in her life like guardian angels. This morning she had been completely alone and terrified. Now suddenly, she had allies who were talking about helping her escape from the nightmare her life had become. "Where would I go?" she asked quietly. "Your sister in California," Mrs. Henderson suggested. "You mentioned her in your letter. Would she take you in?" "Yes, I think so. She's been asking me to visit for years. But the train ticket—" "Don't worry about the money right now," Cole said. "Let's focus on getting you somewhere safe for tonight. And then we can work on the rest tomorrow." As they talked, making plans that had seemed impossible just hours before, Rebecca began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a different life. Maybe she didn't have to spend the rest of her years walking on eggshells and hiding bruises. But first, she had to survive the next few days. Because when Thomas got out of jail, he would be looking for revenge, and Rebecca knew better than anyone how dangerous he could be when he felt like his control was slipping away. The sun had set completely now, and the street lamps were being lit throughout the town. Rebecca walked toward the pastor's house with Mrs. Henderson, while Cole headed back to the hotel where the other cowboys were staying. As she lay down in the guest bed that night, Rebecca stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what freedom might feel like. For the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep without fear of being woken up by an angry husband looking for someone to blame for his problems. But she also knew that this peaceful feeling couldn't last. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. The question was whether she would have the courage to take the leap when the time came. Cole Davis stood at his hotel window, watching the sun rise over Cedar Ridge. His trail boss had been expecting him to catch up with the cattle drive yesterday, but Cole had sent word that he was delayed by personal business. It was the first time in 20 years of cowboy life that he had put someone else's problems ahead of his job. But something about Rebecca's situation had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was the way she had tried to protect herself while lying in the dirt. Maybe it was the fear in her eyes that reminded him of his own mother, who had suffered in silence until the day she died. Whatever it was, Cole couldn't bring himself to ride away and leave her to face Thomas alone. Down the street, he could see Sheriff Wilson unlocking the jailhouse door. Thomas would be released within the hour, and Cole knew the man would come out angrier than a cornered rattlesnake. A gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Henderson, looking tired but determined. "Mr. Davis," she said quietly, "we need to talk about Rebecca's situation. Time is running short." Cole invited her in and listened as she explained what had happened during the night. Rebecca had finally opened up about the full extent of Thomas's abuse, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The physical violence was just the beginning. Thomas had systematically isolated her from friends and family, controlled every penny she could access, and threatened to have her declared mentally unstable if she ever tried to leave him. "She's terrified," Mrs. Henderson said, "and she has good reason to be. Thomas has convinced her that she has no options, no way to survive without him." "What about her sister in California?" Cole asked. "That's our best hope. Rebecca's sister Mary has been writing for years, asking her to come for a visit. She even sent money for a train ticket once, but Thomas intercepted the letter and kept the money." Cole felt anger building in his chest. What kind of man steals from his wife's family? The kind of man who sees his wife as property instead of a person. Mrs. Henderson replied sadly. "But Mary is still there, still willing to help. The problem is getting Rebecca to California safely." They spent the next hour working out the details of a plan. That seemed impossible, but might be their only chance. Mrs. Henderson had connections with women in other towns who helped people escape dangerous situations. These women formed an informal network that could provide safe places to stay and assistance with travel. "The biggest challenge is money," Mrs. Henderson explained. "A train ticket to California costs more than most people make in a month, and Thomas controls all of Rebecca's access to funds." Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch that contained his savings from the trail drive. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy a train ticket with some left over for food and lodging. "This should cover her travel expenses," he said, handing the pouch to Mrs. Henderson. She stared at him in amazement. "Mr. Davis, this is very generous, but you barely know Rebecca. Why would you give up your hard-earned money for a stranger?" Cole was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "My mother lived in fear for most of her life," he said finally. "She died young because she never had anyone willing to help her escape. Maybe I can't help her anymore, but I can help Rebecca." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good man, Cole Davis." "Don't give me too much credit," Cole replied. "I'm just doing what should have been done a long time ago." They agreed that Rebecca needed to leave town as soon as possible, preferably before Thomas had time to organize any pursuit. The nearest train station was in Millerville, about 15 miles away. If they could get her there safely, she could be on a westbound train by tomorrow evening. "What about Rebecca?" Cole asked. "Is she ready for this?" Mrs. Henderson sighed. "She's scared, but she's also starting to realize that this might be her only chance. The whole town saw what Thomas did yesterday. People are talking, and not in his favor. He knows his reputation is damaged, which makes him more dangerous than ever." As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca appeared at the door. She looked pale and exhausted, but there was something different in her eyes. The hopeless resignation that Cole had seen yesterday was being replaced by a cautious determination. "Mrs. Henderson told me about your offer," Rebecca said to Cole. "I can't accept your money. It wouldn't be right." "Ma'am," Cole said gently, "I'm not giving you that money. I'm investing it in something I believe in. I believe that every person deserves to live without fear, and sometimes that belief costs money." Rebecca sat down heavily in the chair by the window. "Even if I could get to California, what then? I've never lived on my own. I don't know how to support myself." "Your sister Mary runs a boarding house in San Francisco," Mrs. Henderson said. She wrote in her last letter that she could use help with the cooking and cleaning. "It's not much, but it would be honest work and a place to stay while you figure out what comes next." "And what about Thomas? Won't he come after me?" Cole and Mrs. Henderson exchanged glances. They had talked about this possibility extensively. "California is a big place," Cole said, "and Thomas is a small-town businessman who's never been more than 50 miles from Cedar Ridge. By the time he realizes you're really gone, you'll be too far away to follow." "Besides," Mrs. Henderson added, "Thomas is going to have his hands full here. Yesterday's scene damaged his reputation badly. People are asking questions about how he treats you, and some of his business partners are having second thoughts about working with him." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the town that had been her prison for 3 years. Finally she spoke. "If I do this, there's no going back, is there?" "No," Cole admitted. "If you leave, you can't come back as long as Thomas is here. You'd be starting over completely. But you'd be free," Mrs. Henderson added softly. "Really, truly free for the first time in years." Rebecca closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, Cole could see that she had made her decision. What do I need to do? Cole felt a surge of relief and pride. This was the bravest thing he had ever seen anyone do. First, we get you to Millerville safely, he said. I'll escort you there myself just to make sure Thomas doesn't try anything stupid. When do we leave? Mrs. Henderson checked the old clock on the mantel. Thomas will be released in about an hour. We should wait until dark, when there's less chance of being seen leaving town. As they finalized their plans, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of terror and excitement. She was about to leave everything she had ever known to start over in a place she had never seen. It was the most frightening thing she could imagine, but it was also the most hopeful. For the first time in 3 years, she was making a choice about her own life. And that choice was to be free. The clock on the church tower struck midnight as Rebecca slipped out the back door of the pastor's house. Her heart was beating so loud she was sure the whole town could hear it. In her hands, she carried a small cloth bag containing everything she owned that truly mattered. Her mother's wedding ring, a photograph of her family, and the few dollars she had managed to save by mending clothes in secret. Cole was waiting in the shadows beside the stable, holding the reins of 2 horses. He had spent the day making careful preparations, studying the roads and planning their route to avoid any chance of running into Thomas or his friends. You sure about this? Cole whispered as Rebecca approached. She nodded, though her hands were shaking. I'm sure. The past 12 hours had been the longest of Rebecca's life. Thomas had been released from jail that morning in a fury that could be heard 3 blocks away. He had stormed home to find Rebecca gone, then spent the rest of the day searching the town and demanding that people tell him where his wife was hiding. Sheriff Wilson had made it clear that Thomas was not welcome to cause any more public disturbances. But everyone knew the law could only do so much. If Thomas found Rebecca before she could get away, there was no telling what he might do. Mrs. Henderson had spent the day quietly spreading the word among the women of the town. By evening, most people knew that Rebecca was planning to leave, and almost everyone supported her decision. The scene on Main Street had opened many eyes to what had been happening behind closed doors. Did anyone see you leave? Cole asked as he helped Rebecca mount her horse. I don't think so. Mrs. Henderson made sure the coast was clear. They rode slowly through the back streets of Cedar Ridge, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Cole had chosen a route that would take them around the edge of town and into the hills, where they could travel without being seen. The night was clear and cool, with enough moonlight to see the trail but not so bright that they would be easily spotted. Rebecca had never ridden a horse at night before, and every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. An owl hooting in the distance made her jump, and she had to grip the saddle horn to keep from falling off. Easy, Cole said quietly. We're going to be fine. Just a few more miles and we'll be well clear of town. As they climbed into the foothills, Rebecca turned back for one last look at Cedar Ridge. The town looked peaceful in the moonlight, like a picture from a storybook. It was hard to believe that just yesterday her life had been a nightmare of fear and violence. Any regrets? Cole asked, noticing her backward glance. Rebecca thought about the question seriously. No, she said finally. I'm scared about what comes next, but I'm not sorry to be leaving. They rode in comfortable silence for the next hour, following a winding trail that Cole had scouted earlier in the day. The horses were sure-footed and calm, and gradually Rebecca began to relax in the saddle. Can I ask you something? She said as they paused to rest the horses beside a small creek. Of course. Why are you doing this? I mean, really. You could have just walked away after yesterday. You don't owe me anything. Cole was quiet for a moment, listening to the sound of water flowing over rocks. I told you about my mother, he said finally, but I didn't tell you the whole story. Rebecca waited patiently for him to continue. She was married to a man who hit her regularly. The whole town knew what was happening, but nobody ever did anything about it. They said it was a private family matter, that it wasn't their place to interfere. What happened to her? She died when I was 15. Fell down the stairs, according to my stepfather. But I knew the truth. We all knew the truth. Rebecca felt tears stinging her eyes. I'm sorry. I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to help someone in her situation, I would take it. Yesterday was the first time I've had that chance. They remounted and continued their journey through the night. As the miles passed, Rebecca began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. With each step the horses took away from Cedar Ridge, she was getting closer to a new life. The town of Millerville appeared in the distance just as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. It was smaller than Cedar Ridge, just a railroad stop with a few buildings clustered around the train station. "The westbound train comes through at 8 in the morning," Cole said as they approached the outskirts of town. "That gives us about 2 hours." They found a small boarding house near the station where Rebecca could rest and clean up before her journey. The elderly woman who ran the place asked no questions, accepting Cole's story that his sister was traveling to California to care for a sick relative. As Rebecca washed her face and tried to tidy her hair, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was still pale and frightened, but there was something different in her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking at someone who had choices. Cole knocked on her door as the train whistle sounded in the distance. "Time to go," he said gently. At the station, Cole purchased Rebecca's ticket and walked with her to the platform. The train was magnificent, a huge black engine pulling a line of passenger cars that would carry her across mountains and deserts to a new life in California. "I don't know how to thank you," Rebecca said as they waited for the boarding call. "You don't need to thank me," Cole replied. "Just promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll never let anyone make you feel worthless again. You're a good person who deserves to be treated with respect and kindness." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. "I promise." The conductor called for passengers to board and Rebecca picked up her small bag. This was it. The moment of no return. As the train pulled away from the station, Rebecca pressed her face to the window and watched Cole standing on the platform. He raised his hand in farewell and she waved back until he was just a small figure in the distance. The train gathered speed, carrying her toward mountains she had never seen, and a sister she hadn't embraced in 5 years. Behind her, the sun was rising over the Montana Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Rebecca settled back in her seat and closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks lull her into the first peaceful sleep she had enjoyed in 3 years. When she woke up, she would be hundreds of miles away from Thomas and the life that had nearly destroyed her. For the first time since her wedding day, Rebecca Mitchell was free. 3 months had passed since Rebecca stepped off the train in San Francisco, and she still sometimes couldn't believe her new life was real. She stood in the kitchen of her sister Mary's boarding house, kneading dough for the evening bread, and marveled at how different she felt. The woman who had cowered in fear back in Cedar Ridge seemed like a stranger now. This new Rebecca had calluses on her hands from honest work, laughter lines around her eyes from long talks with her sister, and most importantly, she slept peacefully through the night without fear. Mary's boarding house was a warm, bustling place filled with working people who treated Rebecca with kindness and respect. She had started by helping with cooking and cleaning, just as Mrs. Henderson had suggested, but she had quickly discovered talents she never knew she possessed. It turned out that Rebecca had a gift for managing the household finances and organizing the boarding house operations. Mary had been struggling to keep track of expenses and bookings, but Rebecca's careful attention to detail had transformed the business. They were now turning a steady profit and had a waiting list of people wanting rooms. "Rebecca," Mary called from the front parlor. "There's a letter here for you." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to see what had arrived. Mail was still a wonderful novelty to her. For 3 years, Thomas had controlled every letter that came to their house, reading her correspondence and deciding what she was allowed to see. Now she could receive letters from anyone, and nobody questioned her right to privacy. This letter was from Mrs. Henderson in Cedar Ridge, and Rebecca opened it eagerly. The pastor's wife had been writing regularly, keeping her informed about what was happening in her old hometown. The news was both satisfying and sobering. Thomas had indeed fallen from grace in spectacular fashion. After Rebecca's disappearance, several other women had come forward with stories about his inappropriate behavior and aggressive conduct in business dealings. His store was struggling and many of his former friends had distanced themselves from him. But the most significant news was that Thomas had finally left Cedar Ridge altogether. According to Mrs. Henderson's letter, he had sold his business at a loss and moved to Denver, claiming he needed a fresh start away from ungrateful people who didn't appreciate his contributions to the community. Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been living with a constant low-level fear that Thomas might somehow track her down, even though everyone assured her it was unlikely. Now, knowing he was gone from Cedar Ridge and had no idea where she was, she felt truly free for the first time. "Good news?" Mary asked, noticing her sister's expression. "The best news," Rebecca replied, sharing the contents of the letter. Mary smiled and squeezed her sister's hand. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "When you first arrived here, you were like a frightened bird. Now look at you, running half this business and making plans for the future." It was true. Rebecca had been thinking about the future a lot lately. She had enough money saved to rent a small place of her own if she wanted to, and several local businesses had approached her about doing their bookkeeping. For the first time in her adult life, she had choices about what to do with her time and energy. She had also been corresponding with a women's organization that helped other wives escape violent marriages. They had asked her to share her story, believing it might encourage other women to seek help. The idea terrified and excited her in equal measure. That evening, as Rebecca sat in the boarding house parlor writing a response to Mrs. Henderson's letter, she found herself thinking about Cole Davis. She had written to thank him several times, but he was always on the move with different cattle drives, and she wasn't sure her letters ever reached him. She wondered if he knew how completely he had changed her life with his simple act of courage. In the space of a few minutes on Main Street, he had shown her that someone believed she deserved better treatment. That moment of validation had given her the strength to take the terrifying leap into an unknown future. As if summoned by her thoughts, Mary appeared with another letter. "This one just came by special delivery," she said with a curious expression. Rebecca looked at the envelope and was surprised to see Cole's name written in careful script across the return address. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was longer than his usual brief notes, and it contained news that made her heart race with excitement. Cole had finally decided to stop his wandering life and settle down. He had purchased a small ranch in Wyoming and was planning to raise horses instead of driving cattle. But the most surprising part of the letter was his request. He was writing to ask if Rebecca might consider visiting his ranch, perhaps even staying permanently if she found the arrangement agreeable. He was careful to explain that he wasn't presuming anything romantic, but that he valued her friendship and thought she might enjoy the peaceful life of ranch living. "What is it?" Mary asked, noticing Rebecca's flushed face. Rebecca handed her the letter, too shocked to speak. Mary read it carefully, then looked at her sister with raised eyebrows. "Well, this is interesting," Mary said. "How do you feel about it?" Rebecca honestly didn't know. The idea of leaving San Francisco just when she was getting established seemed frightening. But the thought of seeing Cole again, of perhaps building something meaningful with the man who had saved her life, was undeniably appealing, I think, Rebecca said slowly. "I need to write back and ask him some questions." Over the next several weeks, Rebecca and Cole exchanged a series of letters that gradually revealed their true feelings for each other. What had started as gratitude and friendship was slowly developing into something deeper and more lasting. Cole's letters painted a picture of a peaceful life in beautiful country, where Rebecca could continue her bookkeeping work for local ranchers while helping him build his horse breeding operation. More importantly, he promised her complete freedom to make her own choices about everything from how she spent her days to whether she ever wanted to marry again. The decision wasn't easy, but when Rebecca finally wrote to accept Cole's invitation, she knew she was making the right choice. She had learned to trust her own judgment again, and her judgment told her that Cole Davis was a man of honor who would never try to control or diminish her. 6 months later, Rebecca stood on the porch of a small ranch house in Wyoming, watching Cole work with a young horse in the corral. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, and the air was clean and sweet with the smell of wildflowers. She was no longer Rebecca Mitchell, the frightened wife who had once cowered in the dust of Main Street. She wasn't even Rebecca Thompson, the grateful sister who had found refuge in San Francisco. She was simply Rebecca, a woman who had learned that courage could be found in the most unexpected places and that freedom was worth any price. As Cole looked up from his work and smiled at her, Rebecca smiled back and thought about how far she had traveled from that terrible day in Cedar Ridge. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led her home at last. And when the local minister asked them a year later if they were ready to build a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love, they both answered without hesitation, "We are." Rebecca's story had begun with violence and fear, but it ended with hope and the promise of happiness. Sometimes she knew the most important journeys start with a single act of courage from a stranger who simply says, "Not while I live." And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that stranger becomes the person who helps you discover who you were always meant to be.